We're going to do a little bit of a review of the scientific method to help you out with your vocabulary and to kind of tie up everything that you've done in the last few days. So, the first thing I just want to point out is that we've looked at different types or different steps in the scientific method in different orders. And it's important for you to understand that it's not always a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as far as where we start and where we end up, because sometimes we have to rethink and go back through the steps again. So yesterday when we started out in the notes, we looked at asking a question, doing background research, constructing our hypothesis, testing the hypothesis by setting up an experiment, drawing conclusions, and then finally reporting the results. In your activity yesterday, after the notes in the video, we looked at making the observation, which was your Chromebook wasn't charging, asking a question, was something wrong with the outlet, forming a hypothesis that if you charge your cell phone in the same outlet and there's something wrong with it, it wouldn't work, making the prediction that there was something wrong with the outlet, and finally testing it by plugging in your cell phone and finding that the cell phone did work, so it must not have been the outlet. So notice that you have the basic steps, but sometimes we have to go back and try again and redo things before we're ready to report our results. The scientific method starts with some type of observation or question. Sometimes it's an observation that leads to a question. Sometimes it's a question that leads to an observation. These are gathered with your senses. It's something that you notice in the world, and it's what leads to your educated guess or the hypothesis. Remember that your hypothesis needs to be specific, testable, and for this class, we always want to write it in the terms of if and then, and we'll talk about how to incorporate or add the independent and dependent variable into the statement. It helps to show you or predict what the outcome will be. The experiment is what we do to test our hypothesis, and it has two parts. The experimental setup that includes the variable or the one thing that we're testing, and the control setup, which is something that's exactly the same, but it's missing the variable. So in the previous Edpuzzle that you watched, you actually saw that there were 3 types of fertilizers. That was your independent variable. And I told you it was missing the control or a corn plant that did not have any fertilizer added to it. Going back to the hypothesis for just a second and looking at the independent and the dependent variable, the 2 parts to that one thing being tested. The independent variable in the previous example was the fertilizer. That was the one thing that I changed or manipulated. The dependent variable was the growth of the corn plant. That's what responds or depends on the independent variable or the IV. What's important is that in a valid experiment that you only test one variable at a time. Both parts of the experiment, the experimental setup and the control setup, have to be kept exactly the same. And we learned that this vocabulary word is called the constants or the controlled variables. So the only one thing we want to change is the independent variable that's in the experimental setup. And we'll look at that as an example in a second. The control is not being tested. It does not contain the independent variable. The control is simply there to be used as a comparison. All of the parts of both the experimental and the control setup that have to be kept the same are called the constants. Oftentimes, these are called also the controlled variables, but I find that that's misleading because variable means to change and control means to stay the same. But you will find constants also called controlled variables. So just to review, remember the IV, the thing that's being changed is the independent variable. The DV, the thing that is being measured is the dependent variable, and that's what responds to the IV.